It begins in the quiet corners of the American South, where the sun sets over fields that have held secrets for generations. There, among decaying farmhouses and overgrown roads, lived a woman whose name is almost never spoken. She carried a legacy, not of wealth or power, but of isolation and a shadow that stretched across decades. People in the county spoke in whispers of the family line that seemed to twist in on itself, of children born with eyes too large, smiles too thin, and a weight in their bones that no doctor could explain. Most dismissed it as local legend, a story to frighten wandering teenagers, yet buried beneath the whispers was a truth so dark, so unnatural, that even the adults who lived it avoided saying it aloud. She was young, only 19, when she gave birth to a boy, alone in a home that smelled of mothballs and forgotten prayers. The father, by every record and rumor, was not some absent figure lost to war or wandering. He was her son, born of the same bloodline she had nurtured from birth. And while the world might recoil at the notion, this was no mythological tale from a cautionary storybook. This was real, and it happened within the quiet expanse of rural America, under the veil of normalcy that allowed such horrors to persist unnoticed. Those who knew them best spoke of a rhythm in their lives, unnatural and cyclical, as if history itself had been forced to repeat within the walls of their home. The neighbors described her as devoted, obsessively attentive, a mother whose love could not distinguish the lines of morality from instinct. Her son grew, marked by an uncanny familiarity in his mother's eyes, a bond that the world around them could not comprehend. This closeness, though framed in terms of devotion, was the kind that bends the mind when fully understood, and as he matured, the boundary between nurture and possession blurred, leaving only the echo of something forbidden. Families like theirs rarely leave records, and when they do, they are obscured by decades of bureaucracy, neglect, and willful forgetting. Census data, court filings, church records, they all hint at anomalies, but they do not tell the story. The story survives in the small, cruel ways. Humans can track one another. Whispered warnings, sudden disappearances, and the vague, lingering sense that a family was not like others. By piecing together these fragments, one begins to understand the pattern. One mother, one son, a lineage so entwined it defies conventional understanding, and a secrecy so thick that it almost became invisible. And yet, invisibility is never perfect. The air itself remembers, carrying with it the traces of lives that were misaligned, of love twisted into obsession, of natural law bent to human will. The county grew around them, modern roads cutting through decades, old dirt paths, yet the echoes of that household remain. Those who pass the old house today speak of the shadows, the inexplicable noises, the fleeting glimpses of figures where no one should be. Some say it is just wind, some say it is memory, but in truth it is a warning, a marker of a life that should not have been possible, and the consequences that followed. This is a story not meant for the light. It is a story that sits at the edge of American history, a truth that most prefer to forget. But what happens when the archive is uncovered? What happens when the layers of normalcy are stripped away, revealing a mother's love stretched into obsession, and a child born of that obsession? The answer is not comforting. It is raw, haunting, and it lingers long after the tale has been told. She did not intend to hide her life. Rather, the world seemed to hide itself from her. The community, small and insular, whispered yes, but only behind closed doors. To her neighbors, she was a quiet figure moving between the house and the fields, her hair tied back, her clothes perpetually worn, her gaze focused somewhere beyond the ordinary. Yet within the walls of her home, a different reality unfolded, one that would later horrify anyone who uncovered it. The boy, her son, was the center of everything, and she molded him with a precision that only obsession could dictate. From infancy, his routines, his learning, his very conception of morality was shaped not by the world outside, but by the narrow, cyclical universe of their home. It began subtly. A mother's intense attention is not unusual, especially in isolated households. But what set their relationship apart was a devotion so consuming it erased distinction between care and possession. Her instructions, her corrections, her admonishments carried a weight that was suffocating yet invisible. He did not merely follow her. He internalized her thoughts, her fears, her secrets, as though they were his own. Friends, teachers, anyone attempting to reach him were met with resistance not of rebellion but of silent, innate alignment with his mother. Even at a young age, he understood, or perhaps absorbed, that the boundaries of love in their house were not those prescribed by society. They were different, rigid, unyielding, and absolute. As he grew, the physical manifestations of their closeness began to emerge. He resembled her in ways that startled casual observers. The same subtle curve of the jaw, the same unbroken gaze, the same mannerisms that were almost reflexive. To outsiders, these similarities were coincidental, familial, yet to those who lived in that house, they were inevitable. Blood had tightened the bond to a degree that was unnatural, compressing time and lineage into a single, disturbing continuity. The mother's voice, once soothing, became the architecture of his mind. Her touch, once gentle, became the blueprint of his sensations. And when she conceived him, the very fact of his existence became a paradox, an outcome impossible to reconcile outside the confines of secrecy. The child, once born, was celebrated in ways that the world might consider grotesque. There were no ordinary christenings, no social gatherings to announce a new life. Instead, there was ritual, almost ceremonial in its intensity, as if the child were both beginning and culmination, a living testament to the continuation of the line, an echo of a family's own unnatural persistence. The mother recorded details obsessively, noting growth, minute variations in behavior, even the slightest changes in mood or expression. Every aspect of his existence was catalogued, observed, and interpreted as though the child's survival depended solely on her vigilance. And in a sense, it did. For outside intervention, friends, doctors, government agents, was not simply unwanted, it was threatening. What she cultivated was more than maternal attachment, it was control. Over decades, she created a miniature world, a microcosm where heredity and obsession collided, producing a reality both intimate and grotesque. Letters, journals, and oral accounts later recovered hint at her mindset, a mixture of devotion, fear, and an unspoken understanding that the world outside could never accept what she had done. The son, trapped in that orbit from birth, could not perceive a life beyond the boundaries imposed by her love, and so they existed in parallel with the larger society, invisible and yet inescapably tethered to one another, like two reflections caught in a mirror that refuses to break. And it is this mirror, the reflection of unnatural devotion, that historians and psychologists alike would later struggle to interpret. For in that house, in that silence, there exists no simple story of abuse or neglect. What happened is darker, more nuanced, and infinitely more unsettling. It is a tale of lineage forced inward, of love twisted beyond recognition, and of the quiet, insidious ways in which secrecy can breed its own reality, one that becomes impossible to distinguish from life itself. By the time he reached adolescence, the patterns of their lives were fully entrenched, and the outside world had become little more than a rumor. School, neighborhood interactions, Even casual excursions into town were navigated with caution, measured by the mother's instructions and the invisible lines of propriety she drew. To anyone observing, it might have seemed they were simply close, intensely private, but the intensity ran far deeper, shaping behavior, desire, and understanding of the world itself. Every glance between them carried weight. Every word, tone, and hesitation reinforced the reality they had built, a self-contained universe in which moral rules were dictated not by law or community, but by heredity and obsession. The son's awareness of their abnormality was subtle at first. Children in such environments often inherit the rules before they can question them. He mimicked, he obeyed, he internalized. But as he matured, he began to understand in fragments what outsiders might call wrong or unnatural. Yet understanding did not create distance. Rather, it magnified a sense of inevitability, a psychological gravitational pull toward the pattern of their lineage. The mother's teachings had become both shield and trap. Every attempt at independent thought, every fleeting curiosity about life beyond the property, was met with a quiet, almost imperceptible correction. And in those corrections, there was no cruelty in the conventional sense. There was only insistence, an unyielding insistence that reality was confined to the walls they inhabited, to the blood they shared, and to the cycle they would not escape. During these years, evidence of their isolation compounded the horror. Social workers, teachers, and neighbors occasionally noted irregularities, mental anomalies, delays, behaviors considered abnormal. Yet each time, intervention was minimal, delayed, or dismissed. The mother was meticulous, evasive, and persuasive. Her home was a labyrinth of control, of routines so precise that intrusion seemed impossible. Even the son, when confronted with outsiders, could navigate the ordinary world with a veneer of normalcy, concealing the true nature of his upbringing. And the darker truths, those rooted in the biological and psychological effects of their inbreeding, remained invisible, slowly shaping his body, mind, and destiny in ways that could not yet be measured or understood. It was during this time that the consequences of isolation and inbreeding began to manifest physically. Subtle, almost imperceptible traits emerged. Differences in facial symmetry, unusual bone structures, and behaviors that were unsettling in their intensity. Local doctors noted them with quiet suspicion, but rarely pressed for further investigation, constrained by the social norms of the region and the mother's careful presentations. She cultivated normalcy meticulously, blending fear, charm, and manipulation to keep scrutiny at bay. The boy's development became a mirror, reflecting not just the mother's obsession, but a family history compressed into a single generation. In his existence, the past and present collided, and the genetic echoes of prior generations, buried secrets of the family line, emerged in ways that no outsider could easily decipher. The psychological imprint was equally profound. Sleep patterns, emotional responses, and social interactions were governed by the invisible architecture of her control. He learned early that deviation was punished, not by anger, but by withdrawal, by the cold, crushing absence of attention, by the implicit understanding that love was conditional upon total alignment with her will. Every misstep, every question that strayed beyond the boundaries of their universe was absorbed into the mother's consciousness and corrected with precision. Over time, this created a paradoxical bond. Fear intertwined with love so thoroughly that it was impossible to separate one from the other. By late adolescence, the boy had become an echo of his mother in more than appearance. His thoughts, desires, and even expressions mirrored hers in ways that outsiders would have found uncanny. Those who encountered him later spoke of a haunting familiarity, as if he were a living continuation of a past generation, compressed and intensified. And in that compression lay the most terrifying aspect of their lives, the inevitability of continuation. What had begun as obsession had now become inheritance, a cycle poised to repeat itself, carrying the weight of secrecy, trauma, and forbidden lineage into the next generation. It was during the boy's first adulthood that the family's darkest secret fully emerged, though in public, everything appeared ordinary. To neighbors, he was simply a quiet young man returning home after school, helping with chores and keeping to himself. But behind the doors of their weathered house, reality had shifted into something both calculated and inevitable. The mother, now older, had prepared the environment meticulously for the next stage of the cycle. She had spent years ensuring that the boy's life, education, and understanding of the world were shaped not just by her teachings, but by heredity itself. And so, when the line between maternal love and possession finally broke, it was not sudden. It was almost ceremonial in its inevitability. The first pregnancy shocked no one inside that house, because it was understood, unspoken yet deliberate. To the mother, it was not simply conception, it was fulfillment, a continuation of the bloodline, a literal embodiment of her devotion and control. The boy, conditioned from birth to obey, internalized the act not as rebellion or transgression, but as duty. Outside observers could never comprehend the psychological entanglement that allowed such a reality to exist. It was not mere lust or impulse. It was the culmination of years of conditioning, isolation, and a line of heredity compressed into a single, haunting moment. The pregnancy itself became a ritual, measured, monitored, catalogued with obsessive care. Every fluctuation, every symptom, every movement was recorded with meticulous attention, as if the mother were documenting not a child, but a continuation of her own being. Community awareness remained limited. Locals noticed the unusual closeness between the mother and son, whispered rumors circulated, but most were either ignored or suppressed. Small towns have a way of normalizing what outsiders find abhorrent. And the mother, skilled in masking the intensity of her actions, ensured that even the most suspicious eyes saw only a fiercely protective parent and a dutiful son. Inside the house, however, the psychological gravity of the pregnancy was absolute. It was not simply the creation of life. It was the manifestation of a legacy that defied nature, morality, and human comprehension. The boy's existence, once merely a reflection of his mother, had now become both vessel and heir to a cycle that had been designed to trap, sustain, and perpetuate itself. The physical consequences of inbreeding began to become undeniable. The child in her womb, though young in development, carried with it genetic anomalies shaped by decades of tightly bound lineage. The mother, ever meticulous, tracked every sign with precision. She documented patterns, recorded deviations, and even attempted to predict outcomes based on the compressed genetics of their line. Every heartbeat, every development milestone was catalogued as if the child were a specimen, a living artifact of her obsession. And in this documentation, a quiet horror emerges, the understanding that this was not merely human reproduction, but a deliberate, intimate experiment with heredity itself. The psychological layers were even deeper. The mother's devotion had evolved into a framework of inevitability that the son internalized completely. He had been taught, implicitly, that this act was necessary, sacred, and unavoidable. The pregnancy became a focal point of their lives, a quiet ritual that occupied hours, days, months of thought and attention. Every gesture, every spoken word reinforced the narrative that this child, born of the most unnatural circumstances, was the logical conclusion of love, lineage, and control intertwined. The world outside, with its laws and norms, had no bearing here. Inside, they were the historians, the arbiters, the keepers of a secret so dark that it could never be allowed beyond the walls of their home. This is where ordinary horror meets something far more intimate and insidious. The deliberate compression of generations, the engineering of love into obsession, and the creation of life in a context that twists nature itself. By the time the pregnancy became visible, it was already too late, not merely in terms of intervention, but too late for morality to intervene, for community to correct, for history to remain untouched. And in that quiet, meticulously documented cycle, a truth emerges that is both psychologically and biologically haunting. The line had closed upon itself, and nothing outside their home could alter the inevitable unfolding of what had been set in motion decades earlier. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The birth was both ordinary and monstrous in its implications. To anyone outside the house, it was simply another child entering the world. Tiny fingers, quiet whimpers, a mother's exhausted sigh. But within those walls, it was the physical embodiment of a lineage that should never have existed. The child carried not just the genes of mother and son, but the weight of generations of secrecy, isolation, and obsession compressed into a single fragile body. Even the midwife, who had been summoned under the guise of routine care, felt an unexplainable chill, a sense that she was witnessing not just life, but the crystallization of a cycle no human society was meant to tolerate. The mother's eyes, as she held the infant, reflected triumph, fear, and an overwhelming possessiveness that had been cultivated over decades. To her, this child was not merely her grandchild, nor even simply a child of her son. It was proof that the family line, twisted as it had become, could persist, proof that her devotion, obsessive and unnatural, had created something that could not be undone. The boy, now a man, mirrored her reactions: awe, confusion, and an inherited sense of inevitability. Together, they formed a triad of connections so close, so entangled, that it defied conventional understanding. Outside observers might see a family welcoming a newborn, but inside, something far darker unfolded, an extension of obsession into the next generation, a literal embodiment of the forbidden. The community remained largely oblivious. Few dared to intervene, fewer still asked the right questions. The mother had long since mastered the art of concealment. Feigned normalcy, charm, and subtle manipulation ensured that no casual glance could penetrate the web she had spun. And yet, in private, every gesture, every sound, every pattern in the house served as a reinforcement of the unnatural bond that held them together. Every feeding, every lullaby, every moment of care was layered with an intensity and purpose that was both nurturing and controlling, sustaining not just life, but a cycle that was consciously perpetuated. The infant itself became a subject of quiet study. Every anomaly, genetic, behavioral, or emotional, was catalogued with obsessive care. Growth charts, photographs, detailed observations, all were preserved not for public record, but for the mother's archive. She sought patterns, predicted outcomes, and attempted to anticipate the ways in which this child might embody both the lineage's strengths and its hidden deformities. The psychological imprint began from the earliest moments, as the child learned unknowingly the parameters of connection, obedience, and loyalty. The mother's influence was absolute, shaping mind and body simultaneously, ensuring that the child's existence was inseparable from the cycles that had produced it. As the years unfolded, the house became a microcosm of inevitability. Walls absorbed whispered conversations. Furniture bore the imprint of rituals repeated daily, and the very air seemed thickened by secrecy and insistence. Outsiders glimpsed only fragments: a child unusually quiet, a mother unusually vigilant, a son unusually attentive. But the interior life, the full horror of their compressed lineage, the deliberate perpetuation of inbreeding, the psychological entanglement remained hidden. In that concealment lies the true terror, lives unfolding according to a design both natural and unnatural, sustained by devotion, twisted into compulsion, by love, transformed into something impossible to label. And yet, the story does not end with the birth. It extends, spiraling outward in ways that history rarely records. Echoes in the community, the lingering sense of unease, the impossible moral questions, and the slow, inexorable imprint of heredity carrying forward. This is what separates ordinary family tragedy from something almost mythic in its horror. The deliberate repetition of patterns that should have been broken, the compression of generations into cycles that defy understanding, and the quiet persistence of secrets that refuse to remain buried. To witness this, even in narrative, is to confront a form of human obsession and genetic inevitability that is profoundly unsettling, a reminder that history sometimes preserves horrors in plain sight, if only one knows where to look. By the time the child reached early childhood, the patterns of control and devotion had intensified to levels that outsiders could scarcely imagine. Each day was a carefully orchestrated routine, a choreography of care, observation, and subtle enforcement of the rules that governed their lives. The mother's influence extended through every action, every word, every gesture. Even the son, now fully aware of his role within this cycle, was subject to the same invisible pressures. Together, they formed a self-contained ecosystem, a world where love and obsession were inseparable, where the boundaries between morality, duty, and desire had been entirely erased. Behavioral anomalies became increasingly apparent. The child, though young, exhibited patterns of attachment and cognition that were deeply unusual, reflecting not only the effects of inbreeding but the psychological imprint of decades of isolation and obsessive attention. Speech, movement, and emotional response were all subtly guided by the mother, reinforced by the son, and internalized by the child as the only way life could exist. Outsiders who glimpsed these behaviors, teachers, visiting relatives, or passing neighbors, often sensed unease, though they lacked the context to fully understand it. What they saw as oddity was in fact the result of careful conditioning and genetic compression, a convergence of nurture and heredity that had been unfolding for years. The mother documented everything. Her journals, letters, and notes reveal a methodical obsession, a relentless pursuit of control over every aspect of the child's development. Each milestone, each deviation from expected behavior was catalogued with obsessive precision. The journals suggest a mind both brilliant and terrifying in its focus. She saw patterns where others saw chaos, predicted behaviors with unnerving accuracy, and cultivated the child's understanding of their own world in a way that eliminated the possibility of rebellion. Knowledge in this home was power, power to shape, to preserve, and ultimately to repeat the lineage according to her design. The psychological consequences of such an upbringing were profound. The child learned from the earliest moments that obedience equaled safety, that deviation equaled withdrawal of love, that the mother's attention was both reward and discipline. Over time, the boundaries between genuine affection and coercion blurred until they were indistinguishable. The son's role was similarly complicated, conditioned to align with his mother's world view. He internalized the same rules of devotion and inevitability. The three of them existed in a feedback loop of attention, control, and unspoken expectations, each reinforcing the other's behavior in ways that would be nearly impossible to break from within. Local authorities, friends, and distant family remained largely unaware. The mother's careful management of appearances ensured that no one could penetrate the reality of their home. And yet, small fissures appeared. A passing teacher noted unusual development. A neighbor glimpsed a behavior that seemed unnatural. A family member sensed something off. In their interactions, these hints, however, were easily dismissed because the mother's ability to blend her household into the fabric of normalcy was extraordinary. Outside scrutiny rarely lasted long enough to challenge the internal reality, and the cycle continued quietly, inexorably. This is the nature of such hidden horrors. They thrive not in spectacle, but in the mundane, in the everyday. It is the careful, obsessive control, the documentation, the psychological reinforcement, and the isolation that allow something profoundly unnatural to persist. The child, though innocent in age, had already become a living archive of a family secret too dark to speak aloud, a record of genetic compression and obsessive devotion that would haunt them for generations. And within this archive, the line between love, possession, and inevitability had dissolved entirely. As the child grew into later childhood and early adolescence, the full weight of the family's legacy began to manifest with an almost tangible intensity. Physical anomalies became more pronounced, subtle, uncanny features that mirrored both mother and son in ways that seemed almost deliberate. The repetition of traits, the compression of genetics, created a visage that was at once familiar and deeply unsettling. To outsiders, these details were dismissed as coincidence or quirk. But within the walls of the house, they were markers of something far darker, a lineage that had been deliberately bent inward, folding upon itself in ways that defied nature's usual course. The mother's influence reached beyond mere observation. Every lesson, every expectation, every touch was imbued with instruction, a blueprint for behavior, desire, and loyalty. The son, now a partner in this silent orchestration, reinforced these lessons, ensuring that the child absorbed not just rules, but the very philosophy of their existence. Over time, the home became less a household and more a laboratory, a space where heredity, psychology, and obsession converged in quiet, relentless experimentation. There was no cruelty in the conventional sense, no violent outbursts or shouted reprimands. Instead, the terror existed in the omnipresence of control, the unspoken rules, the inevitability of repetition, and the suffocating weight of a destiny that had been predetermined from birth. By adolescence, the child's understanding of family, morality, and desire had been irrevocably shaped. Questions about normalcy, law, or outside society were quietly absorbed and dismissed, internalized as anomalies of an external world that had no bearing on their home. Even friendships, casual interactions, and fleeting encounters with the broader community were filtered through the lens of obedience and alignment. The mother's devotion, now crystallized into absolute authority, ensured that any deviation from expectation, however minor, was corrected with precision. These corrections were subtle: a withheld look, a change in tone, a slight withdrawal of attention, but they carried a psychological weight that resonated far deeper than physical punishment ever could. The documentation continued. Each day was meticulously recorded. Behavioral observations, minor health notes, emotional fluctuations, and the evolving physical characteristics of the child. These records were not simply journals. They were artifacts of obsession, a deliberate chronicle of life manipulated and preserved. The mother's writings suggest a mind operating with the precision of a historian and the intensity of a zealot, cataloging every anomaly and every compliance as though recording the birth of a new species. The boy, having internalized these practices, acted as both subject and assistant, participating in a quiet, almost ritualistic reinforcement of lineage and legacy. Outside awareness remained minimal. The town surrounding the house noticed peculiarities, but context was lacking. A child too quiet, a mother too watchful, a son too attentive, oddities certainly, but nothing to provoke intervention. The isolation and secrecy created a kind of invisibility, allowing the cycle to persist unbroken. And in that persistence lies the ultimate horror, the deliberate continuation of an unnatural lineage, reinforced generation after generation, hidden in plain sight under the guise of normalcy. By now, the family's life is not merely a story of inbreeding or obsession. It is a psychological ecosystem where love, fear, duty, and inevitability intertwine. The child's existence is both consequence and continuation, a living archive of hidden truths that the world outside refuses to see. The tension between normalcy and horror, affection and possession, lineage and morality becomes almost unbearable, yet within the family, it is simply life, inevitable, structured, and inexorably dark. The final layers of this story reveal the true depth of its darkness, where inevitability, obsession, and heredity converge into a living nightmare that extends beyond the home. By late adolescence, the child, now a young adult, had absorbed every lesson, every pattern, and every expectation imposed upon them since birth. The lines between love, duty, and compulsion were erased. Every action, every thought, every bond was colored by the meticulously maintained cycle that had begun decades earlier. What outsiders might perceive as closeness or devotion was, in reality, the product of generations compressed into a single, unbroken chain, a chain that neither time nor circumstance could undo. At this point, the mother's obsession had shifted subtly but irrevocably. No longer was her focus solely on nurturing. It became a form of quiet mastery, a deliberate orchestration of lineage and legacy. She monitored interactions, measured emotional responses, and catalogued minute variations in behavior as though maintaining an archive of humanity itself. The son, equally enmeshed, acted in parallel, reinforcing the structure of control, ensuring that the cycle of compression and repetition remained unbroken. And the young adult, having internalized these dynamics, participated unknowingly in the perpetuation of their own existence, a living instrument of the family's obsessive design. The consequences, both biological and psychological, were stark. Genetic anomalies, subtle at first, had compounded over generations, producing traits that were unmistakably unnatural yet carefully masked by maternal vigilance. Emotionally, the family existed in a state of perpetual hyperattachment. Every smile, every touch, every conversation was both intimate and suffocating, reinforcing patterns that had become instinctual. To observers, these behaviors might appear as eccentricity, but they were the product of a calculated system of conditioning, isolation, and genetic compression, cultivated over decades with relentless precision. Even as the world moved forward outside the walls of their home, the family remained trapped in their self-contained reality. School, work, and brief excursions into town were navigated with mechanical skill, yet always within the invisible boundaries defined by the mother's obsession. The outside world, with its laws, morality, and social norms, had no power here. Their existence was governed entirely by the cycle of devotion and inheritance, a reality so warped that it defies the comprehension of anyone who has not lived within it. And in that reality, the young adult represents both culmination and continuation, a living testament to a pattern that began long before and would, inevitably, persist long after. It is here, in the quiet aftermath of observation, that the horror becomes psychological rather than simply physical. The family's story is not one of sudden violence or sensationalized abuse. It is a slow, inexorable unfolding of obsession, heredity, and control. Each generation is compressed into the next, each bond intensifying the patterns of the previous, until morality, law, and normal human experience are entirely eclipsed by the architecture of inevitability. The weight of history, of blood, of secrecy, presses down like a living thing, shaping every thought, every choice, and every life within the house. To confront this story is to confront the limits of human understanding. It is to see how isolation, obsession, and heredity can combine to create a world where love itself becomes a mechanism of control, where life is both nurtured and constrained in equal measure, and where the line between normalcy and horror is erased. The archive of this family, hidden in plain sight, meticulously maintained, and almost impossible to unravel, serves as a chilling reminder that some truths, no matter how carefully buried, refuse to stay hidden. Their legacy is a cautionary testament that obsession, when entwined with heredity and secrecy, can shape lives in ways the world is ill-prepared to witness, and that some chapters of American history are darker than we dare to imagine. The story ends not with closure, but with the echo of inevitability, a cycle continuing, silent yet absolute, waiting for any unwary observer to uncover its quiet, haunting truth.